Hey, what's up? Hello, everyone. Welcome into Fantasy Filmball, the show where we turn movies into sports and sports into something we don't talk about here. My name is Matt.
My name is Dyl, and it's finally here. Dune Part 2 is among us. It only took like an extra 5-6 months since the initial release date. I mean, Part 1 got delayed all this time. Part 2 got delayed, so whenever Messiah comes, I'm expecting another delay. But before we dive into our thoughts here today, if you're new here, consider, a comment with your thoughts about Dune. A like, a subscription keeps you involved here because the new Oscar season is kicking off shortly. But today, not as much Oscar talk. We're talking about Dune.
And we're a little bit late getting to this because
Very late.
This is it's like the worst week to release Dune for us specifically, because like it came out right when we were already struggling to finish off our Revisiting Best Picture series, to finish off our final predictions, talk about all of the Oscar stuff from this year. And so yes, we are a little bit late, but honestly, I think we're right on time because now the Oscars are done and we can officially start talking about movies for this coming year. And this is my favorite time of year because we start to find new films we love, new things to talk about, and we get to start to wonder, what can Dune Part 2 do? Before we get into really detailed plot details, this is a full spoiler discussion. It's in the title. If you haven't seen the movie, get the fuck out of here.
Yeah, go watch it.
Go watch it. What are you doing? Come on, man. But if you're still here, we're going to start talking spoilers in 3, 2, 1. I'm just going to say right off the bat, Dylan, I know you like this movie quite a bit, but we're going to give a disclaimer here. Even though you like this movie, you probably will sound a little bit more negative because I love it so much. So we're going to have like a little bit of a back and forth here about the quality of this thing.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a very fun discussion because, I mean, like you see here, got my nice trusty AMC special edition popcorn bucket in hand, and I think that's the only way you can go in and watch Denis Villeneuve's Dune Part 2. And, I saw this in Dolby, and I think this is truly an experience because, to be completely honest, like Matt just said, I do have some small issues with the films overall. I think the opening act does drag a little bit. It's not a negative drag. Just compared to the second half of the film, it feels like a drag. But by the conclusion, I fully understand the reason for that inclusion. Maybe not surprising for long-term viewers here, but for new people here, huge Austin Butler guy here. He steals the show here as Feyd-Rautha. His introduction sequence, his aura, his presence at the film just hit me so well, and I was excited. It captivated my attention, and I know that opening sequence inside the Harkonnen Arena, my hair was raised on my arms. I could feel the goosebumps. I was so engaged. I was giggling with every line of dialogue. I was just locked in. I think the technical elements here, like cinematography and costume design, are vast improvements from Part 1. And I really, really like the growth with the characters of Paul, Chani, Stilgar in this installment. I'm still confused in some aspects. I've watched this movie twice now. It's definitely an easier watch than Part 1 was on my initial viewing. Maybe because I've seen Part 1, I think 6-7 times at this point.
Whoa.
I vastly prefer that film over this one. Part 1 I'm giving a solid 10 to, while Part 2 I started at a week 9. I'm currently at a very, very strong 8. But both times I've been very elastic walking out of the theaters, and I cannot wait to go back to Arrakis for my third watch of Dune Part 2.
I'm so fascinated by the fact that you preferred Part 1 to Part 2, because in my mind, I see Dune Part 2 as a step up in every way. I love the first one, but it took me a little bit of time to get there. I first saw the first one, I saw it at TIFF back in 2021, and I went in being told by everyone, this is Dune is a Lord of the Rings level event. This is one of the big movies of the year. It's a massive blockbuster. It's going to be packed with action. All I knew about Dune was riding sandworms. And when I went in to see Dune Part 1, that's not what you get out of that movie. It's a much slower film. It's methodically paced. It builds the world, and it's all about the politics of these great houses. And at first I was like, that was good, but where's the Lord of the Rings of it all? Where's the spectacle? I wanted the spectacle. And Part 2 delivers on the things that I felt like I was missing out on in the first film. I got that blockbuster spectacle. I got the themes of it, which I think are so deep. I'm going to dive really deep into those themes in the film. And yeah, every single element of this, I think, stepped it up from the first film. So yeah, it's going to be hard to beat for this as my favorite movie of the year. It's brilliant in every way. Blockbuster spectacle to the max. This feels to me like a Dark Knight moment where we see a filmmaker who's been killing it over and over again, finally making a film that just has absolutely floored me and feels like it's changed movie-going forever.
Again, like you said at the beginning, I am going to sound a little bit more negative than I actually am with this film. It's just the nature of when two people talk about a film. Funny enough, it's how you probably felt during Oppenheimer.
No, and I was literally about to say that, is that we just finished this whole season of Oppenheimer, and I can think back to when we both saw it, and you came out of it being like, this is the greatest thing, 10 out of 10, favorite movie of the year, hands down, and I was a little disappointed, and this was a pattern for me last year, where I'd go into a movie being really excited for it, and I'd walk out of it being like, it was good. Was it great? No, but it was good, and so I'm really happy that I can finally set myself back on track and have a film that I'm really excited for that lives up fully and surpasses my wildest expectations.
So I guess we should dive into some of the elements of this film. If you are a returning viewer here, we just finished up our Best Picture Revisiting series where we kind of flowed those episodes by going down each category that received a nomination. Here, obviously, Dune Part 2 hasn't been up for the awards yet, so we're just going to hit each category we kind of feel like talking about. And we talk about the film as a whole, so it only feels right to go to the director's chair. Denis Villeneuve, the man who was snubbed for Part 1, is back here in Part 2. And I have two thoughts of his direction. I do agree that he is stepping it up across the board. He's getting bolder. He's getting more grand. It's more extravagant. All things I'm really enjoying. I think some of my small critiques don't come from his directorial choices, but more from his screenwriting choices. So I will say more of those here shortly. I just think some of the ways that we learn about these characters and the world continues to build is super engaging, but it's not giving me everything I wanted. Like how Part 1, each sequence, it feels like it's adding more to the lore, to the knowledge. We're learning so much about these characters. But for Denis' direction, I mean, this is his bold vision. I mean, on the press tour, he's been talking about how he's been wanting to make this movie since he was a kid. He's had storyboards of this first sequence of Paul riding the sandworm. And I think it all comes down to a very meticulous craft planning for this film, and you can see that ooze through. And I just think he is just killing it on all fronts in the director's sense of this film. And I mean, I could pull certain sequences like, oh, I love the way he decides to shoot this, the way he decides to bring it all together. But Matt, you read the book, so I kind of feel like here you can kind of add in a little stuff compared to what Denis decides to change here on a directorial level compared to like how it kind of came across in the book reading from like text to screen.
So I set off on a task where it was a week before I had tickets to see the movie, and I went, I wonder if I can read the book in this time. And then I did, which was, it's not a difficult book to read. It's just long. It's 850 pages. And so I was like dedicating myself to reading over 100 pages a day because I had 6 days left at the time. And that was definitely tough. But I'm not huge on the book. I think it's very good, but there are some elements of it where I don't think it's the strongest version of the story it's telling, and I do think that Denis' vision for it steps it up in every way. I'll talk about some of the changes made when we talk about screenplay, but the direction that he takes with it is so purposeful. It is so careful. It's so purposeful and it's so thematic. Every single choice that he makes in the filmmaking, in the just the grammar that he uses in the shots, he's deliberately building out the themes literally just in how he shoots sequences. And I'll talk about that in just a moment here. But something that really stands out to me about Denis Villeneuve's work is he has a perfect style for blockbusters because he knows better than I think anyone else how to balance the epic and the intimate. His films are so quiet and reserved, and they move quite slowly and methodically, and yet they can feel so big. And he's not like a Michael Bay director where he needs it to be fast and punchy. He can take those moments to breathe. And he does that in Dune Part 1 as well. He does it in Arrival. Sicario is a great example of that. That could have just been a fast-paced action movie. But no, he takes the time to breathe, and he finds those character moments. And that's what makes his film so good, because that balance is just perfect. You're here, he knows your butt is in that seat for these big action scenes, but there are moments where Timothée Chalamet's Paul and Zendaya's Chani character, the two of them just sit together, and you just see them look into each other's eyes, and that's what the movie is really about. They push those moments, and so it's that balance, epic, intimate, and it's so beautifully done. And treating the material with patience, trusting the audience's intelligence, it allows to build up to moments instead of just going crazy right from the start. He moves slowly. He lets things build until suddenly it's just there, and it's the spectacle that you cannot deny. One of my first scenes where he really takes patience setting it up is the first attack on the harvester. When it's just slowly moving, we see the harvester land, we see the Harkonnens come down, they're guarding, and we start to see the pipes coming out of the sand, and we start to wonder what's going to happen, and then it just builds and builds and builds, and suddenly it's a full-on attack. It's a full-on assault on this harvester, and that's just an incredible moment, and it works because they don't rush into the action. They build to it, and that just goes through the whole film. But what I think he's doing with his cinematic language is so cool. And Villeneuve got into a little heat because he said that he hates dialogue. That's not really what he was saying. He wasn't saying he hates dialogue or that dialogue's unnecessary. He just says that, to make a movie, you're not supposed to just tell the story with people talking. You're also supposed to show how the story unfolds. What he does here, the dialogue's great, but he specifically makes choices to show us what we should be thinking, to bring us through the story. And he does this by using the language that we would typically see in a blockbuster, using the different shot compositions, the montage, the rhythm, the sweeping music. And by using these things that are so recognizable as blockbuster ideas, as the way that you shoot a blockbuster, the way that things have been shot ever since, the way that epics have been shot ever since Lawrence of Arabia, he's taking those elements, and by putting them with this story about colonialism, about false gods, false prophets, and oppression, and the way that religion can control people, he's honestly making an anti-blockbuster, because it subverts that whole idea of heroism, of the hero's journey, of wanting to root for this type of character, and it flips it on its head. And that's what I think is so brilliant about Dune Part 2.
You touched on something that I think is such an integral part of Denis Villeneuve as a whole, because he's a director where I will admit he either makes one of my favorite films of the year or one of my biggest misses of the year. Something like Blade Runner 2049, I think, is a pretty tough watch. I haven't revisited since my first watch. I really was unengaged with that. But then there's stuff like Arrival. There's stuff like Prisoners. There's stuff like Sicario that I eat up. And then Dune Part 1 was the first film from him I absolutely adored from top to bottom. But you talk about the way he tells these stories with the visuals, not relying on the dialogue. And I think that's part of the reason why Part 1 was a little bit of a struggle with me at first, where I enjoyed it. I liked it a lot, but I didn't get it. The first watch I had no knowledge of Dune. Same as you. I just knew it's sand. Zendaya's in the trailer. Timmy's there. It's a Villeneuve movie, a director who I like but I don't love. And I went in and I was like, this is cool. Do I understand what it's really trying to say? Not as much, but I like it. And then I watched it again. I was like, I like this more. I watched it a third time. I like it more. And I saw it one more time during its initial theatrical run. Like, I love this. I think I went from like a week 8 to a very strong 9. And then I recently got it all the way up to a 10 with that revisit before watching Dune Part 2. I think it really works in Part 1 how he tells the story without just verbally telling it to you. How you see these sequences play out like you were talking about. However, in Part 2, maybe it's only because I've seen it twice, I am still a little little lost with the progression of the story. I feel like part 1 is slower pace, but it works for the smaller story it's trying to tell. It's Paul leaving Caladan, Paul getting to Arrakis, and then the Harkonnen taking over House Atreides, and then now Paul and Jessica are in the desert. I feel like part 2 has a lot more to tell, and with telling the story a little slower at the beginning, it takes its time. You get to feel Paul's connection with the Fremen grow over time, but once Villeneuve, I guess, realizes, oh, we still have X, Y, Z, 1, 2, 3 to tell, and we have like 90 minutes left, let's speed it up. And I feel like the methodical pace stuff kind of goes out the window. As I mentioned before, I love Feyd-Rautha's entrance sequence during the Harkonnen Arena area, but I feel like that scene starts and we don't really get much of him again. And I feel like if we got an extra 5-10 minutes with that character, his power, his weight, his psychoticism would just seem so much more impactful to the story than ultimately how I felt at the end once we finally get to the final duel. And I think that goes with a lot of the Harkonnen characters in this film. Like, the Baron is such an integral part to part 1. Here, he feels like he's like the 10th, 11th most important character. He gets one scene and then he kind of goes kaput. I really like Dave Bautista's Rabbit in the first one. I felt like he had a character. In this one, I feel like it's the opposite of what Dave Bautista really is trying to say of him as an actor, where he's just screaming the whole time and he's just so angry, which I feel it. I get it. I know why from watching the first movie. But then again, his character's disposed of in 2 moves by Gurney. And it just feels like we take all this time for this build-up, and then the conclusion, once we hit those moments with our villains of this film, obviously we have new villains heading into the next movie who are previous heroes, but I just feel like their payoffs don't really match to the weight that we were built up with them ahead of time. And I guess that leads me to the screenplay. I wish we had a little bit more verbiage, a little bit more time with these individuals to feel their presence a little bit more, because I really do love the visual way he tells this. Going back to the Harkonnen Arena again, Feyd-Rautha's entrance is amazing. It may be my favorite Denis sequence he's ever shot, even more than Paul on the Sandworm in this film, even more to sequences in part 1, stuff in Arrival, stuff in Prisoners. It's so engaging, it's so visually captive without saying much. Like, we don't have to hear like, oh yeah, the Baron said, I don't want to drug this guy because I want to see him do it. But you can see in his face the reason why he did that. You can see in Feyd-Rautha how he's reacting to it. And I just love that. And then it kind of feels like we lose the visualness later on to just be like, okay, well, we need to get to point A. We need to get to point B. We need to get to point C. And it just moves a little bit fast for me. I feel like we really miss Eric Roth in this film, because I feel like he added a lot of extra stuff to part 1 in terms of the character building. Because as you mentioned, Villeneuve isn't as focused on dialogue. I feel like that's where Eric Roth's strengths are, as we talked about with Kills of the Flower Moon. His inclusions of that film added a lot of extra stuff for the characters in that movie to feel more connection to them. And with this film, since there's so many characters to keep up with, why I love watching all these characters, engage with all these characters. A 3-hour runtime is kind of long, but I honestly could do more, just so we can get a little bit extra moments with these people. While I do feel like Paul's journey feels pretty seamless, once he drinks the water of life, I feel like it goes really fast for his turn. Obviously, we have the visual storytelling that Villeneuve's doing with the sequence with Lady Jessica, but when we get Paul, it doesn't feel as expansive as it could have been. I know I just rambled for a long time there, so I'm really interested to hear what your thoughts are, Matt, because for viewers out there, I try not to read other people's stuff, listen to other people's stuff before talking here, so we can get like raw, natural thoughts. So like, I have so much bouncing in my head. I've seen this twice now in the last 2 weeks, and I'm like, I want to talk about it, I just haven't talked about it yet. So yeah.
So you mentioned that the first movie to you, it feels like that's not the meat of the story, and it's building up, and you liked that pace of building up, and then here it all kind of moves too quick. Would it shock you to learn that in the book, the first movie, the book's like 850 pages, the first movie is probably 650 pages of that?
I think I can see that. Again, I have not read the book here. So my knowledge of the source material is coming solely from this is my first interaction with all of this stuff. And I feel like Dune is definitely something like Game of Thrones, definitely something like Harry Potter, where you get a lot more if you know the no. But if you don't know the no, you may be like a little step resolved, a step back from it. I guess just to try to put it as bluntly as possible, I love everything about this movie besides the screenplay. And
That's fair.
I just think, for me, it's not even I don't like the screenplay. I just feel like we have seen from a whole previous film and a whole hour and a half inside this own film a pace it sets, a way it wants to introduce you to these characters. And then it's like, oh, Warner told us this can only be 250, or we need to get to the end and we only have an hour left, or we're out of budget, or whatever. How can we get through this very quickly? Because I'm loving the sequences that we're getting. Harkonnen Arena, the battle that we get between the Fremen and the Emperor's army, that battle sequence between Paul and Feyd-Rautha. I'm loving all of this stuff. It's just like, I feel like it's moving so fast where we're not getting to know the whole no of it. It's kind of like, you got to pick up on it. You got to get on our wavelength, which I applaud Denis for being bold enough to do it. I just feel like maybe I'm alone in this, but I feel there would be other viewers who are like, okay, I wish you could give me a little something extra to latch on to.
I can see that. I guess what I'm saying here is that, I think that you don't need more time to develop this stuff, because this is already giving far more time to all of these things than the book even gives. So It's already inventing a ton of stuff that's not actually in the book, just to boost the runtime, to make these arcs kind of feel full. Yes, well, I think part one is all about setting up dominoes. This is where we watch them fall. And to also talk about another adaptation of it, David Lynch's Dune is like 2 hours. The first hour 45 is Dune part one. And then the last 15 minutes is the entirety of this movie, and it's all a montage. So to me, what I like here is that in previous versions of Dune, I feel like this part of the story, where the themes actually are, where it starts to talk about religious oppression, where it starts to talk about fanaticism, where it starts to talk about how colonizers use religion as a method of control, which can quickly go awry. All of those themes are typically glossed over in every other version of Dune that I've witnessed, whether it's Lynch's Dune or the actual book itself. And so I thought, maybe I'm giving even more credit to this movie than I should be, because I think it's one of the best adaptations I've ever seen. But the main thing I want to talk about with the screenplay here is a little thing from a book called Save the Cat, which is probably one of the most cliche, most talked about screenwriting books of all time. And one of the things that I like from Save the Cat, one of the things that I haven't thrown out from it, is the idea of the promise of the premise. And to me, Dune Part 2 is one of the best examples of fulfilling this promise to the audience that I've ever seen. You go into this movie wanting these massive action scenes, these sandworms, you want to see the politics, you want to see eco-terrorism elements of this. All of that is like, it's what you're going to the theater for, and it delivers. It fires on all cylinders as this epic scale sci-fi blockbuster. And that's something that and that's really impressive to me, to be able to deliver a really coherent film that just completely ticks every single box that an audience going into this type of movie could want. I think it's really, really impressive. Villeneuve has really fixed that. He has really gone into these themes without being heavy-handed. And what it says to me, this is a story about what happens when the elites buy into their own myths, about how colonialists, how imperialists will use religion as a way to keep people satiated, to keep people hoping for something in the future. And when those ideas start to run rampant, when the elites, the ones who are supposed to be controlling those myths, when they start buying into that mythology, that's when things can go really, really bad. And it reminds me a lot about what we're seeing in certain parts of the United States right now, where since the 80s, one of the parties has been telling a whole bunch of lies and scapegoating and just putting things out into the world that are not necessarily true. And they knew it wasn't true, and they were using it to get voters. And what happens when the fanatics that buy into those lies end up being the ones that get into those government seats? And I see massive parallels between Dune and the journey of Paul becoming this messiah, becoming this fanatic leader, to what we're seeing in real time in the United States at the moment. Big question I have to ask, though. Is Paul actually the messiah? Is he actually Kwisatz Haderach? Is he actually Lisan al-Gaib? What do you think, Dylan?
I think they tell us in the movie that it's a sham, that it's not real. His mother is trained to drink this and survive. He can probably drink it and be fine. It's the side effects part that they don't really know what goes in. That's why Lady Jessica is scared to drink it, but once she drinks it and knows it's okay, she very much encourages Paul to do the same. Maybe it's Alia saying it, maybe it's Jessica, blah blah blah. But I just think that it kind of plays very nicely. Like, this is not an issue I have for the screenplay. My screenplay reservations come, maybe it's more of a pacing thing than an overall script thing. I do very much love how they go in talking about fanaticism, going into about religion, and going into just what a messiah can be. And I don't think Paul is, but I also don't think anyone is. Bene Gesserit can say, like, it's supposed to be this person, it's supposed to be this person. It can be anyone. It's just who fits it in the time that they need it. And clearly Paul is fitting it in this time. So maybe he is, but he isn't by destiny. He is by chance.
And yeah, it's fully coincidence. He keeps fitting into these different things, not because of prophecy, but because of coincidence. And anytime he doesn't fit into something, they ignore it. But anytime he does fit into something, they go, "Oh, as it was written, as it was written." And it really is. It really goes into those ideas of, this is someone that they've been waiting for. They're being told and given what they want, and because of that, they can be controlled. And this is about how religion is a weapon. It is a tool that can be wielded by oppressors. And I think back to that scene in the very first movie, the opening scene, where Chani, Zendaya's character, says, "Who will our next oppressors be?" And it immediately cuts to a shot of Timothée Chalamet. Because he is an oppressor. He is not a messiah.
No, I really like that shot as well, and I really like how, again, it plays to Denis, and again, it plays to Denis' visual storytelling where he doesn't explicitly say it. And you talked a little bit before about how Herbert had to write a whole separate book because people are misconstruing it. We'll be completely honest. There's definitely people out there right now misconstruing Dune Part 2, thinking Paul is the hero, he's the savior, he's the messiah, we should follow the Mubdeed, everything like that. So I think that, I know we're not talking about Messiah right now or the potential of a sequel. I think Denis has a tough challenge on his hand of what he does next. Does he follow in Herbert's footsteps, doubling down and making it blatantly obvious, or does he continue to do what he's done in both of these films by suggesting it, proposing it, but it's up to the viewer's interpretation to follow that?
Well, I haven't read Dune Messiah yet. I plan on reading it very, very soon. I have it. I just need to get to it. But there are a lot of changes that he made from the book to the screen that I think are going to make it hard to do it exactly the way that it's done in Herbert's original novel. But some changes that I think really worked. In the book, Chani has zero agency. Like, she is just a concubine that kind of exists in the background as like a love interest character that's just convenient. And she blindly follows Paul throughout. And they even include the line here, she'll understand, I've seen it. But I don't think it's going to be that simple. I think there's going to be a lot more conflict there because Zendaya's Chani, as opposed to the book, she has such agency. She is such a strong character, and she's not going to blindly follow Paul. And that's what I loved about the conflict of this movie. It's the conflict between Paul's desire for revenge and his need to convince the non-believers because he wants revenge, as well as his love for Chani and his understanding that he's not actually the Messiah. But I think in the end, he really does believe that he is the chosen one because he believes that he is special. But yeah, so that's a great change. As well, in the book, Alia is a super baby who ends up assassinating the Baron.
Yeah.
So that Anya Taylor-Joy character is meant to be a toddler with the full intelligence of an adult. I loved the choice to make this a way to tell the time of the story, that we see this fetus growing through the story. Every once in a while we'll cut, and at the beginning we see it's like the it's nothing. It's like a little eraser head baby, and then by the end, it's like a full baby. And we have seen that progression. We understand how the time has gone through. Fade Rotha, definitely probably a bigger part of the book. However, I think much more intimidating here, much more, I think, used a lot better. There's also some stuff cut out, like there's a whole arc with Thufir Hawat, who is the Stephen McKinley Henderson character. And I like that Paul has more doubts here. I like that Paul doesn't buy into his own myth too quickly, and instead Jessica kind of pushes him towards that darkness, towards that evilness. She, in the book, doesn't want him to drink the water, whereas here she basically forces him to.
Moving away from the script, we spent a lot of time there, but I think that's really important because it's an integral part of what Dune is as a whole, not just part 2, but part 1 as well. But the performances also are what elevates this material to a new level. I think no matter what you think about part 1, you have to admire the ensemble that they have put together. They have people hitting all the boxes you want, and people who you don't typically think of in these roles doing a fantastic job, like Jason Momoa pulling something off like that. Phenomenal. I've mentioned Dave Bautista before, and then you have people like Oscar Isaac, Rebecca Ferguson, and then people in small roles that we didn't get to see much of, like Javier Bardem and Zendaya. They get the time to shine here in part 2. Because yes, Timmy's back. He's doing so much. He's doing a lot more. He's phenomenal. I come out of this really, really admiring Zendaya's performance. I feel like she's doing a lot with a little. I know you've mentioned that Chani is a lot more
Active.
Expanded character from the book. And I feel like even though she still doesn't have all that much to do here. She's still a number 2 character in terms of like plot importance, but she's showing so much with her face. Especially the later we get into the film, you can see how she's losing faith in the Paul that she knows, the Paul that she loves, but she's staying with it because she wants to be with her people. She wants to be with the Fremen, but you can tell each step she's not really on board with it. And we never see that moment for her to blow up, but I'm really excited to see what they do and Messiah with her character, because one thing I guess we didn't talk about in the script that I think is really integral here to the performances is, I didn't read the book, but I know in the book there's a time jump between the start and the end of the book. And I feel like that may have helped a little bit for the story, but I also like how there isn't, because it helps for the character of Alia. But I feel like for Paul's connection with the Fremen, that extra year could have helped a little bit to build why they believe him so much. But Chalamet sells why they should believe him, and Javier Bardem really sells why they do believe him. The first time I watched this, I saw it as a little bit too comedic, but on the second viewing, I fully bought into this is how a religious fanatic would act in these situations. If they think they are seeing their Messiah they've heard about their whole life, that their parent, their grandparent, their grandparents talked about, of course they're going to be acting like this when they make these sort of actions. And then, as I mentioned before, Fade Rotha, Austin Butler, he's doing so much in such little screen time. His presence is unmatched. I mean, he won me over in Elvis, but I know he didn't win many people over in Elvis, but I hope now people are won over with what he's doing here.
To speak about Javier Bardem, who is my standout by far in this, Javier Bardem is just brilliant. But the way he balances humor with genuine terror is really, really well done. And I think it thematically says a lot about fanaticism. It's really, you can look at fanaticism from a distance and find it to be quite funny. You know, I spend a lot of time laughing at Trump supporters. I'm just going to name drop it right now. I see a lot of those rallies, and I look at like QAnon posts online and I go, how the fuck do people believe this shit? This is wild. There's something innately hilarious thinking about like the January 6th riots. Seeing a dude with American face paint in furs and a Viking helmet who calls himself the QAnon shaman, that's fucking funny. Until suddenly they're storming the Capitol and trying to overthrow democracy. And that is what Javier Bardem's performance is. It is easy to laugh at until suddenly it's knocking at your door and it's real and he is taking action. But I love the Life of Brian-esque moment there where, Paul is just like, I'm not the Mahdi. And then it immediately cuts to him being like, only the Mahdi would say that he would be humble enough to say that he is not the Mahdi. He must be the Mahdi. And everyone goes, as it was written. And I'm like, oh my God, that's just, it's so perfect. But yes, I just love that balancing between humor and terror, because it is so truthful to what a fanatic is. And there's so many other people in this that are brilliant. The entire ensemble is just like, I love when you can watch an ensemble and see that every single person is supporting everyone else. There's no one supporting actor, because everyone is just
I feel the same.
Working together to help push each other up. They're all working to make everyone else's performance look good. And that is just, it's so, so good. Timothée Chalamet, I think it's a massive step up from the first film for him. Rebecca Ferguson becomes an amazing villain with some almost Gollum-esque moments as she speaks to Alia. And, oh God, it's so good. So good. She becomes so frightening as we see her turn to darkness through the whole film. I gotta say, I don't love Austin Butler as much as you do, but I think his performance is very fun in an over-the-top, exaggerated Eddie Redmayne, Jupiter Ascending kind of way, where it's just goofy, and it's so, he knows what he's doing, he knows what the movie is, he understands what this film needs from him, and it's just so good. But people calling it like the best villain performance since Heath Ledger in The Dark Knight, I'm like, what are you talking about? What are you talking about?
See, I wouldn't go that far because he doesn't have enough to do.
Yeah, that's why he's expendable.
If he had more, maybe I could not get to the level of Heath Ledger, but say maybe sense him, because like he is just doing so much and it's working so well. But I think it's those type of performances where if it works for you, it's going to work so well, and if it doesn't, you're gonna be like, that's kind of whatever, he's trying too hard. But I guess I just want to touch on Timmy real quick, because all I really said was he's good, but I do agree it is a big step up. But I don't think this performance works without what he did in part one. I think they're working in tandem. You see the innocence, you see the reservedness, you see where he's confident,
his desire to be good too. He wants to be good, but he also is corruptible. He wants revenge.
And like, he's not confident, but he's not confident enough in part one until that fight with Jamis. And then here in part two, you see right out of the bat, he has that little bit of extra oomph to his character where he kind of is buying into this a little bit, but he's not sold yet. And he's not sold until Jessica pushes him over the edge. And then that sequence he has where he gets up, he speaks in the Fremen language, is another sequence in this film that just sent chills down my spine. And like I mentioned before, I did sound negative before, but that's all the negative stuff I have. From the rest of the point on, I'm going to be gushing just like you are here. I know Chalamet won't be in any sort of awards buzz, but let's think about this. Let's think about this. If Dune 1 came out when it was supposed to, and Dune Part 2 came out when Top Gun Maverick did, I think Timmy would have beat up Paul Mescal, unlike what Tom Cruise could do for that film. However, it comes down to competition for this year.
We've seen time and time again that actors in blockbusters, they might not end up making the lineup, but they're in the competition. They're in the conversation. People talk about them as a possibility. And if next year in February people are talking about, could Timothée Chalamet get in? This is a year that's going to be vastly affected by the strikes. A lot of films don't exist that should have existed. So could happen.
Maybe.
Could happen.
My one reservation, I know we're not talking awards right now, is Rebecca Ferguson was so good in part one, and that was a weaker year for supporting actress, and she got 0 mentions anywhere. I'm going to be hard to believe that someone can pull one off for this film. But your case about the weaker year could hold true later down the line. But yes, Rebecca Ferguson, I think, is great here as well. I think I prefer her part one performance a little bit more. I think kind of how you feel about Butler is kind of how I feel about Ferguson here, where she's kind of trying a little too hard, and it's coming off a little... a little cartoonish. Where for Butler, I'm believing it, but for Ferguson, at times, especially after she drinks the water of life, it does get a little comedic at times, but it's not a negative. It's just like, oh, I'm not taking this probably as serious as I probably should be. Like the little voice she's doing, where she's like, oh, we have to take advantage of the weak ones first, or stuff like that. Where that part's like a little haha, but she is really good. She's very frightening. You see the menacing, and I like from hearing you talk about before how it's a change for that character. I think it makes sense for the story that she is the one pushing Paul, because without his mother's push, I wouldn't buy that he would just do this on his own. I think he needs that push from someone who he loves, who he knows loves him for who he is, not because he's the Messiah. But I just think there's so much good stuff coming out of this acting ensemble. And I mean, I talked about in the first film how Chani, how Stilgar don't really have much to do. Same here with Florence Pugh. She's, I think, really good in her like 2 scenes. Obviously, she's not delivering any giant monologues or isn't getting to scream, but you buy what she's trying to do in this film, and I'll be very intrigued to see what she gets to do in Messiah. Same with Léa Seydoux as Margot Finning.
Yeah, I'm not sure how Léa Seydoux will play into it, because that character has been changed quite a lot. Very, very different. But I've heard that the princess does have a lot more to do in Dune Messiah, so I'm looking forward to much more Florence Pugh.
I guess the last thing before we move away from the acting is just to touch on some of the Harkonnen real quick, just because, as I mentioned before, I really like that aspect of the first one, of how we got to learn so much about the Baron and like the Apocalypse Now kind of like shout outs they were doing, the homages they were doing throughout. But here, I just feel like the Baron was sidelined. Stellan Skarsgård is good, I guess, in his like 10 lines of dialogue he gets to do, but I kind of feel like he's kind of disposed of really easily, and he's reserved to like 4th tier villain here instead of being the number 1 like last time. And then Bautista, as much as I loved him in 1, here again it's just like he feels one note, which it makes sense for what's happening to him, why he would be so pissed off, why he would be so angry, why he's such on nerve. But also, I think it just goes to like an extra 5 minutes with the Harkonnen. Could be a scene of the Baron with Robin where they're just talking about, hey, Fade's taking over now. Obviously, they would say it different, but like a scene like that where we get to see it kind of blow up in front of him would, I think, added so much more for these 2 characters and their eventual payoffs at the end, because Gurney's a character who I was surprised at how much we got of him in this film. I was kind of expecting him to be kind of like a one scene person. Like, oh, he reconnects with Paul, as we saw in the trailer, and then they start to fight. I didn't think he was going to be around as often as he was. And Josh Brolin's good. I just wish that we could have got some of those extra Brolin scenes could have been transitioned over to the Harkonnen, just so we can get a little extra oomph for the villains that ultimately are going to be disposed of at the end of this film.
Mm-hmm. I think part of it is that the villains aren't really important, because through the whole first one, the whole first movie, we're told that the Harkonnens are different. They're brutal. They're much more violent towards the Fremen, and it's true, they are much more violent towards the Fremen. But in this film, it starts to set up that these terrible, villainous, evil people might not be that much worse than the Atreides themselves, that the Atreides are also twisted in different ways, and perhaps it's not that we've misunderstood them, but we've misunderstood the Atreides for sure. We've been on their side, and we're not seeing that they're really both just as bad as each other. But gotta say, Dave Bautista was a standout for me. His outburst scenes were amazing, and to the point, yes, it's unsatisfying to see him killed in such an anticlimactic way by Gurney, but to me, what that says is that Rabban has talked up a big game the whole time, but he never does his own fighting. He's always hiding behind someone else, and he has this reputation for being a monster. And when Gurney kills him so quickly, it almost feels like his entire reputation has been a lie. And I really like that. Also, in the book, Gurney does not get to kill Rabban. And it's a really satisfying change here, because obviously we know the whole history between Gurney and Rabban, where Rabban had Gurney's entire family killed in front of him and then gave him a scar. And it's great to see him take care of him so quickly, so easily. So, yes, is it unsatisfying? A little bit, but it's also much more satisfying than the source material. So, let's get into some of these juicy tech elements, because this film is one of the most gorgeous looking and sounding films I've ever seen. Gotta say, with the cinematography, it looks even better than the first. There's more variance in looks. Not a problem that I had with the first one, but I will say just like a criticism I had was that everything felt very samey in Dune Part 1, where, it was all this desert planet, and a lot of it was shot at nighttime, which meant, because they traveled at night, it meant that it was dark a lot of the time, and especially when you're not seeing it in an IMAX theater, you're seeing it at home, there's a little bit of light on the screen. It's really, really hard to see what's going on at times. That problem is not here at all. There is a brightness to this film and a variance between looks. It's not just on Arrakis. We're going to Getty Prime. We're going to the homeworld of the Empire, which I can't remember the name of. But there's so much variance between those looks, between the color grades, and I loved that we didn't really have many nighttime scenes at all. It was all very bright, it was all very warm, very orange. It was gorgeous, and it sets a perfect tone. And I really also loved the use of dust to cover up details in some of the fight scenes. There's one fight scene where they blow up the siege, and Rabban comes down to the ground, and it's just smoke and dust everywhere, and the Fremen are in the shadows pulling the Harkonnen in. Oh god, it's so good. And the close-ups, those are some of the most stunning, like, big close-ups I've ever seen on an IMAX screen. As well, oh my god, the Black Moon of Getty Prime. There's one shot there that just blows my mind, where it goes from the color. Obviously, the Harkonnens wear this pale makeup. They wear all black and white, so they already look kind of black and white grayscale. But there's a moment where we follow the Baron from the color version of the world out to where the sun is. And it's in one shot we see the saturation drop and the contrast raise, and suddenly it's just this gorgeous black and white. Like, if we want to talk about black and white IMAX, fuck Oppenheimer. Let's talk about this scene.
Yeah, I'm down for that. I love that as well. I mean, we go back to the time we saw the trailer like a year ago, and we both went to be like, hey, this looks different, and we want to see more of this. And I really liked that sequence on Getty Prime. I'm going to mention it before, mention it again. It's my favorite sequence of this film, of both films, honestly. But yeah, Greg Fraser's cinematography here is immaculate. We talked in a recent episode about how we love Ludwig Göransson and how he is like the new face of score, and I kind of feel Greg Fraser's that for cinematography. He's just bringing so much freshness to his films. We have the Batman, we have Dune 1, now here Dune 2, and just the way he goes about shooting stuff, whether it's those close-ups you've mentioned before. I really like how him paired with Denis Villeneuve also fill up the space in their frames. There's not a lot of just dead space in the frames. There's always something going on, whether that's in the foreground or in the background. You can go to battle sequences where obviously there's a battle in front of us, but there's stuff behind. The final fight between Fade and Paul, if you're in the wide shot or if you're in the close shot, you can still see faces reacting in the background to each punch, each smack of the knives. And I just think the cinematography here is a step up across the board. And I love the cinematography of Part 1. That orange hue that we get the opening sequence, as you talked about, is such a great just establishing shot for this film, because we get to see someone we didn't see with Part 1. We didn't get Arrakis at dusk like this, and it just adds a new element to show us, hey, this is new. We aren't in Arrakeen. We are in the desert now. We're seeing something completely new. This is something that Paul hasn't experienced before. It's new for his journey. And I just feel like throughout this film, while it does have callbacks to the first film with its visual style, it's elevating at every possible turn. And yes, I mean, just to mention it one more time, the transition with the Baron and also with the Bene Gesserits walking in, and you see their costumes just invert colors. I just think it's just so phenomenal. And I'm not someone to often go to YouTube just to watch scenes, to think, oh, I want to relive that scene. I'll just rewatch the whole movie. But I can see myself, when Dune's out, just rewatching that scene over and over and over again.
It's one of the most masterful sequences and masterful inventions. Like, the moment when I realized, oh, the reason it was black and white, it's not a flashback or anything. Because seeing the trailer, I was like, why are they going to black and white? That's such a weird choice. But then seeing how they actually do it, and how the black and white is actually the sun itself, and this is just the world of their planet. Everything is in grayscale because the light coming from the sun is grayscale. Ooh, Denis. My God, dude, you just blew me away with that idea, that invention. It feels so perfect. How have we never seen any sci-fi movie try this before? I think it's because everyone's scared of black and white.
I mean, as we mentioned before in our director part of this, Denis Villeneuve is just a master of his craft. He has such a way for visual storytelling, but as I mentioned back there, I had some issues with the story overall. Maybe that is from a screenplay perspective, but maybe it's from an editing perspective in terms of the pacing of the second half of this film. I don't know if it's the first half or the second half. The first half feels more in line with what part one was, while the second half of this film feels amped up to be a little bit quicker pace, unlike what part one was. I enjoyed the second half more, but part one feels more in tone with the first. But besides that, the fight sequences here are so well edited. You always have a sense of where you're at in the battle. That's one issue I have, not to throw shade to like MCU, DCEU, or to other blockbusters, but I always lose where I am in these sequences because they either stay tight, they inverse angles, like, oh, you're looking head on, and well, now you're looking from the backside. There's no in-between shot. Here with Dune, Denis always making sure that you know where you're at. I think my favorite example of this isn't even the final fight against the Emperor's army. It's the time when Paul and Chani have like that bazooka thing shooting. You never feel lost, even though there's so many moving parts there. We're starting off under the sand, coming out, fighting, knowing who is where at what time, because their faces are covered, so you don't know who's Paul, who's Chani at first. But the editing allows you to know, hey, pretty quickly, this is Paul, this is Chani. Besides maybe a little blue ribbon on Chani, nothing else is signaling who's who. But just the way they cut between both of them, as well as the Harkonnen like plane up there, I just think is just phenomenal. And I just feel like this film has so much to offer in the editing room. And besides the little qualm with the pacing, the rest of the editing is just some of the best in years.
For me, the things that stand out about the editing are the way that it keeps track of time, the use of the baby to create a timeline, and
really
the way that
cool.
it builds that timeline. I think it's absolutely masterful. And the battle scenes, like you said, fantastic. I won't linger on that at all. I will say there's one moment in this film of editing that I think is my one complaint. There is a cut between when he's in the desert, when
Yes.
Paul is in the desert talking to Jameis, and imagine like being like, what should I do? Where should I go? And then he learns he should go south, and then it cuts, and suddenly he's drinking the blue goop, the water of life.
Oh, mine's different then. Okay.
Oh, really? I'm okay. I think it is different because you're talking about the montage where he is supposed to walk across the desert.
Yes,
and then
he
he's
sees
there with
Jameis.
Chani.
Yeah, he sees Jameis
yes.
first and then becomes Chani. At least to me, my issue with that wasn't... Maybe it is part of the editing, but I feel like there was something that we missed there. Because he's going to do this journey that Stilgar wants him to, but we don't see him finish it. And it just cuts to a scene.
I think we do, because Zendaya comes to find him and goes, you're walking wrong, and also... Because the last scene that we see, Chani's saying he's going to die out there, and then they're all going to lose their Messiah, and then we're going to be back where we started, so I'm going to go help him. And then, we see her help him, and then it kind of does a montage thing. I don't think we need to see him get to the end of that and come back. Personally, the bit that I find a bit of a bump comes back to that pacing issue that you were talking about, where it just rushes to the ending, and that's as soon as he decides to go south, there's like a complete 180. He goes from being like, I don't want to drink the goop, I don't want to drink the blue water of life, don't make me do this, I don't want to do, and then suddenly it was just like on a dime he just turns into a monster, and that's the one edit. I wish that there was a little bit more there to allow us to get to that point of like, he's going to drink the water of life, he's going to do this.
Again, like you said, it goes to the pacing where I feel like another 15 minutes. You don't even have to give us 30. Personally speaking, I want one more scene with the Baron, and then give me a scene after he drinks the water or right before he drinks the water, just to show why he's doing it and the immediate reflection of it. Because, as you mentioned, he's like, "Oh, I don't want to drink it." He has a discussion with Chani, saying like, "I feel like I have to do what's needed to be done," or that's not verbatim, but he also sees Jamis, and Jamis tells him go south. And then he drinks the water, and the next scene, he's screaming and fremen at them, "I'm your Messiah." I'm like, whoa, how did we get here? Like, I know why we got here, because of Jessica's planting of the seeds and encouraging him throughout. And we saw the vision inside of Jessica, and now we see another one inside of Paul. But I just wish we had one additional non-vision scene to showcase why this transition happens.
We talked editing. Sound goes hand in hand with that, and gotta say, this is some of the best blockbuster sound I've ever heard. It hits you like a massive wall of sound. It rumbles your seat. You feel it in your stomach. Like, I felt every single molecule in that room, every air molecule just vibrating around me. It's crazy. But unlike some other films that just blast you with the sound like that, it doesn't ever sacrifice the dialogue. I'm looking at you, Christopher Nolan, specifically Interstellar, specifically Tenet. Sometimes when you get blasted with that wall of sound, you can't hear what they're saying. And yet with Dune Part 2, every single line of dialogue is clear. Every single line is crisp. It never sacrifices understanding for spectacle, but it delivers on both fronts.
This was my second ever film in Dolby after Renaissance last year. And I wish I had a Dolby theater where I live, because just like you said, the sound rumbles. You feel it. You feel like you are on Arrakis with them. And like, for the second time I saw this film, I saw it in IMAX. I'm not used to my seat rumbling in IMAX, and it happened on multiple occasions inside this film. And I just think the sound work here is so engrossing. And I think there's a lot of the tech and craft elements in Dune Part 2 is they step up from the first one, because they make you feel like you are here with them. You're not just watching them, that you are in these scenes with them. And I feel like sound is a perfect example of that. But I guess one thing I think goes hand in hand with the sound, and we'll touch on more later, is the lack of sound at times, of how the score either drops out or the audio just drops, and you just hear the clanks of the knives in the final fight. You hear the blast of the explosions. You hear the sand rumble in the wind. You hear the spaceships roar over the city. And I just feel like this is stuff that we didn't get in the first one because of how overpresent the score was. Score I love, but you notice the score in the first one. Maybe contrary to public belief, I don't notice the score in this one, but I think that's due to the sound work.
I actually like this score better than the first one.
Ooh, I'm on the opposite.
Well, okay. Let me just talk about why I like the first one a lot, but it's taking a lot of heavy metal influences, which is very fitting because I feel like Dune, the book, inspired a lot of heavy metal groups, and so it has some of those aesthetics to it. You know, the guitar is so heavy, the bagpipes are so present in the military sense there, but it really leans into those rock sounds and that grungy, heavy element. I don't love that texture. I'm not a big metal guy, I'm going to be honest. And so with this score being much more synth, much more Vangelis vibes to it, like this felt more like Blade Runner than it felt like the first Dune, I loved that. And there was less of the chanting in this, which was great because the chanting is good for a novelty, but I think there's a little bit too much of it in the first one. And so a lot of this does feel recycled from the first film, but I gotta say, the score that we do get, the love theme between Chani and Paul, I can't remember how it goes off the top of my head right now, but it's a simple theme, and it comes up at the beginning of the film, and it keeps coming up, and it becomes this last hope of Paul being good. And it's beautiful. It's beautiful. I think I listened to that one song on the score like 20 times in a row after seeing this movie. I just had it on repeat. But yeah, the main theme is gorgeous. I do have a question though, just to go quickly to Oscar chances. Do you think this has enough new music to qualify for the Oscars, knowing that they need it to be 80% of the score has to include absolutely no elements used in the first film?
That I'm not entirely for sure for, because we were pretty confident of Fableman's not qualifying, and that did qualify. So I clearly am not a good judge of that. But to go back to Dune Part 1 score to compare it here to Part 2, I really loved how in Part 1 the score was part of the sound and part of the editing, and it was used to transition from scenes. And I feel like we lacked that this time. However, its replacement use for the editing is what you talked about before with Alia, showing, hey, this is how we're transitioning. We cut the sound. It's usually maybe someone talking to her very quietly, faintly, obviously through the skin, or it's just pretty quiet overall. And it's definitely a contrast from the first one, which I feel like works at times, but I also just miss, like from my rewatch of Part 1, how the scenes just flow together because of Hans Zimmer's score just rumbling in. What if it's those guitars, the drums, the chanting women, they just come in, and it sounds so good, but it's so maximalist. So I like how this one reverts that and versus it, something you talked about during our Oscar predictions for last year when this was still slated to come out in 2023. To be nominated, it needed to be different. And I think this is different, but to your last point, does it have enough new stuff? That's the true question. But I do love Chani's love theme, or whatever the official title for it is. It's the one that's in the trailers. Really, really good stuff.
Quickly, we'll touch on visual effects. There's not much we can say about the visual effects beyond they are flawless. They are perfect.
I do have one thing. Eyes apparently are visual effects. That's something that doesn't get talked about. I like that. I saw that in an interview clip.
Very interesting.
I like that.
Wow. I like that too. That's really cool. Yeah, I got to. What do you have any standout visual effects moments? I mean, obviously the eyes.
The eyes for me, because of how hard, one, that must be to do, and two, I mean, you talk about Barbie costumes last year. We're gonna get Dune costumes this year, and to see how many botched eyes we're gonna get. But I really like the mirror on the Emperor's ship. I think that's a very standout sequence. I just think of the reflectiveness for it. And again, that's another moment of sound, of score. The score is not very present, and you just hear that ship come in so strong, especially in Dolby. The visual effects there, I mean, obviously this film's immaculate in that department, but that was one that we hadn't seen in the first one. There wasn't much of spaceships outside that sequence leaving Caladan. So this time, we got a little bit more of that, and I think that's the most impressive so far.
Two moments I loved. There's a montage where they're attacking the Harkonnen harvesters, and there's a moment where all the harvesters are dropping, and we see these lasers go through them, and they just explode in the distance. Gorgeous moment. The other thing that I think I was just like floored by was after they set off the atomic bombs and they ride the worms towards Arrakeen. Ooh, that's cinema right there. It's brilliant stuff. Yeah, I was just absolutely floored by some of the use of visual effects. You mentioned costumes, though. Let's talk about these costumes, because I think the beauty of the costumes in this is how they're used to illustrate changes within characters. How Paul goes from this highborn with his perfectly made still suit coming from the city of Arrakeen to becoming a Fremen and using their still suits, learning their ways, and then the descent into darkness as he takes on the role of the Messiah. He ends up kind of going in between the two of them. He's no longer Fremen, and he's no longer highborn. He is something between them. I love, and it also shows as he learns that he is a Harkonnen by birth. You kind of see that in his costuming change. Same with Jessica. As she becomes more and more controlling, more and more fanatical, her costumes become more and more overbearing, more outrageous. And the last costumes I got to shout out, Florence Pugh's Princess Irulan costumes are fantastic. Like I just think about the chainmail headdress with the little knives on it. Woo, amazing. Style. That's style.
Yeah, right after I saw Dune Part 2, I went to the Met in New York like a week later, and I saw like the Knights in Arms or the Coat in Arms section. I'm like, oh my gosh, look, it's Florence Pugh's costume. I want one of those. That just looks like such a cool costume to wear.
I think you could rock it.
But I wish I could rock it. But part one, a costume I do want to rock is a still suit. I said this in part one. I think those costumes are phenomenal. I think they're stepped up here because, like you talked about, they're not the high class, pretty, made from manufacturer ones from the city. No, this is what the real people use out in the desert. So they have that little beat, that little dirt look to them, and I feel like it just shows, like, again, to what you're talking about, how Paul is one of the Fremen in these sequences, learning their ways of life. But I also really like the Harkonnens, like, little war get up, like what Fade Rotha comes in with a big muscle suit and his little cape on the back. And I don't know, I just feel like the costume design of Dune isn't, like, I guess it kind of goes to some other stuff we've talked about here in the past. It's not super in your face, but it's such technically good across the board. But then it has a few pieces that are just bold, like the princesses that are just super in your face. And you know, I've seen some
Bene Gesserit.
Yeah, the Bene Gesserits as well. I've seen some flack online for the Emperor's gowns. I like them. They look like they would go with him. Like, do you really think Christopher Walken's out there and like what the princess is wearing or what anyone else is? No, he's just gonna get a little gown. It looks comfy. It looks cozy. I just think the costuming of Dune Part 1 and Part 2 are just it's just so cool, and like obviously not in a Barbie way, but in stuff like you could see if you lived in a world like this, you could rock.
Production design is an element that I think it's really, really well done, but there's less to do here than the first film, because in the first film you have to establish the world, you have to establish the city, the architectural styles that are used throughout the city, there are palaces, and in this one there's much less to design outside of Getty Prime. Like, Getty Prime is perfectly designed, and both the costumes and production design really play into that monochrome look that it's establishing. But on Arrakis, a lot of this film is just deserts. And even the Sietches, we've seen the architecture there in Part 1. So I really liked the production design, but I was definitely less blown away by it than I was in the first film.
This is a rare element I do think is a step down from Part 1, because even the parts of the main city that we didn't get to see that we see this time don't feel as detailed, because like the first time we get to Arrakis, Paul's exploring the main house. You see such detail on the walls and to the art, the architecture, and this time it kind of just looks like, oh, these are just buildings here. But I know that's the point. The Atreides aren't there anymore. I do really like, again, to go back to the Harkonnen Arena setting, I love how that setting looks. How much of it is VFX compared to how much of it is real? That's another question. But still, visual effects play a part in production design, and I just love how it's just a massive coliseum. It's so grand, and when you walk afterwards with Fade Rotha, when Margot Finning comes over, like, that hallway looks so... It just looks... I don't know the right word to say it besides cool. Even the room that they go into also just has this very much... like, this looks like where Harkonnens live, where they're at. And, like, the little Harkonnen lab... I don't know if it's a lab. Like, their little battle, like, command center, where they look at where all their planes are being blown up at, or all their sand collectors are being blown up at. I thought that was really cool design that we didn't see in the first one. But I do agree, it is a step down, but that doesn't mean it's bad in any sense.
No, it just means that there's less here that's like new. There's less that's fresh. But you know what does feel fresh? The makeup and hair. Because Fade Rotha and the Harkonnens, we see so much more of them, and the design of the makeup on them is so incredibly well executed. They are terrifying to look at. And Austin Butler, his design himself just being completely smooth shaven is just like very unsettling, very uncanny valley, but the makeup that they do on him is so perfect. The war makeup and just the base makeup as well. Also, the evolution of Lady Jessica's makeup throughout, showing her descent into fanaticism, is really well executed, with her face being covered by more and more of these tattoos, these religious sayings. And as well, there's just a general grime and dirt and sand that we see on each of these characters. Not to mention the eyes, which are VFX. I assume there's some practicals going on there too, probably a mixture of both. But everything they do with the Fremen, it's so low key, but it's large scale. There's a lot of makeup, and it almost goes unnoticed, but what they're doing is so well done.
I akin the Fremen to like any war movie where you have to make them look beat up,
Yeah.
dirty, like they've been
Or
through it.
yeah, something I noticed during the Oscars the other day was the Society of the Snow makeup reel, and I didn't realize how much they had to do to make them look. They hadn't washed. They have this dirt and grime caked on to them, and seeing that, I was like, oh, okay, I understand a little bit more about this nomination now. I get it.
And then I also agree with Lady Jessica. I think we had dashes of it through Paul's visions in the first one. And I really like how they came full circle because, like, with watching part one pretty recently before part two, you get to see how accurate his vision was with what her eventual design would lead up to be. But yes, like I talked about when we first saw the initial trailer last year, the main reason why I predicted to win makeup and hairstyling was for the Harkonnen, was for Fade Rotha. I didn't know this, but I saw this in a clip of an interview with Austin Butler the other day. He wasn't allowed to shave his head or to shave his eyebrows or his hair or anything. So they had to fully cover up everything because he was shooting the bike riders at the same time. So he couldn't just because he wanted to full commit, go bald, shave off all his eyebrows.
Wild.
But whoever's Searchlight, I don't know, Searchlight, no, 20th Century wouldn't let him for the bike riders. So yeah, I think what they do there, I think is phenomenal. And it's not just Austin Butler, all the Harkonnen, with Bautista as well. I like how he looks different. You can still see like the beat upness of his forehead, of his skull. I'm assuming that's due to his past, maybe through fighting, or maybe even the Baron himself taking pain out on him. I like how he looks not as perfect as the rest of them. And then the Baron, we get a lot less of him here, but he is still truly a feat of makeup.
Yes. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. We gave Brendan Fraser's fat suit an Oscar win. I mean, Baron Harkonnen, because they had to do that, and they had to make it submergible in liquid, in goop.
And Goop, his little butt pops out in this movie.
Yeah. So we've talked about all of the elements of this film. Obviously, we think this is a technical masterpiece. I think it's just a masterpiece. Obviously, you still haven't come around yet, but don't worry, you'll come around. I have seen it.
I'll become a believer.
You will become a believer. I think by the end of the year that you will have seen this enough times that you're going to be on my side. You're going to be riding with Muad'Dib. But we are going to talk Oscars. This has been a very long episode, and if you're just here for the Oscars, welcome in. You probably skipped all the way to the end just to hear what we have to say, because it is time-coded. Anyways, let's talk these Oscar chances. Dune Part 2 is our first major contender of the year, but the question we have to answer is, how big of a contender is this? Got to ask you, Dylan, what would it take for you to consider this as a contender to win Best Picture?
Well, I can see a narrow way through where this could, and it's what it's doing right now. It's the box office. It's holding just like Oppenheimer. Almost identical opening week, almost identical second week drop. The one difference is the weekdays. Obviously, March is not July. People have work, people have school, people have this, people have that. So the box office, I think, will come a little bit short of what Oppenheimer had. The Metacritic score is pretty good. The Rotten Tomatoes score is pretty good. My issue for Dune winning Best Picture is the fact of what you told me in our last video talking about the Oscars. Avatar: The Way of Water was a part 2. This is a part 2. Avatar: The Way of Water looked better across the board than part 1. It got less nominations. This, I think, will get less, but we'll get some different ones that maybe will make it even out. But I think this will get less wins. The only way I can see this being a Best Picture contender is if by some miraculous travesty, Warner Brothers has not greenlit Messiah by March of next year. If there is no greenlit for Part 3, maybe they will go all out for it this year. But if Messiah gets confirmed, I think this drops out of director. It's not a Best Picture top 3 movie. It's like Part 1, where it's going to get all these nominations. It's probably going to win a few of these categories, but it's not really fighting for a win.
So I'm not sure if I fully agree that it's because it's a part 2. I would say it's because the consensus is it's great, but there are a lot of people that I'm hearing and a lot of backlash that I'm seeing where people are thinking this is not as good as part 1. I might think it's a lot better, but here I am talking with you who says that you prefer part one. And when you have people saying that, if it's not undeniably the best film in the series, then people are going to go, well, if I would have preferred the first one to win, so I'm not going to vote for this one. Like that's going to be a knee-jerk reaction. So if we already have people in March saying it's not that good, guys, come on. I don't think people are going to take it seriously enough to give it a win. And the reason I say that is the Metacritic score is in the high 70s, low 80s. That is not winning range. That's not the territory that we need to see a winner, especially when it comes to a movie in a genre that isn't usually recognized by the Oscars. Seeing it be like floating around 78 to 80 on Metacritic says that people like it, but some critics are not admitting that this is a serious film, that they're saying this is just popcorn fare, and that to me says voters will not take it seriously enough to award it beyond technical categories. So I want to ask you, Dylan, the first Dune movie, it got 6 wins. Sound, editing, production design, score, visual effects, cinematography. Over, under, 6 wins. What do you think?
I'm going to go under as of March 11th. But I currently would have it as visual effects as an automatic 1, sound as a number 2. I think it's getting 2 at minimum. Then it can go up from there. So it's not going to have the drop off that Way of Water had where it's only winning 1. I think there's the potential to add in editing. There's the potential to add in makeup and hairstyling, and there's the potential to add in costumes. So I can see it max out at 5 with a low of 2. Obviously, we don't know what the race looks like this year. Who knows? Dune Part 2 could be the zeitgeist film of the year, like Oppenheimer. Denis Villeneuve, people are saying this is his best film so far. It could catch on. Combine that with his snub of last time, there's a little bit of a narrative there. That could be a potential another win. And if you're winning director at that time, maybe you could pull off something else. Cinematography likes to go with director. I just don't know if Greg Fraser's going to win another one in terms of the same franchise. He could win another Oscar, but I don't know if he's going to win another one. I don't think he's going to win another one for Dune. So I'm currently maxing at 5, but I could see us get up to 7. But I don't think score is repeating. I don't think production design is repeating. I could even see production design maybe get snubbed. And then I think cinematography should get nominated, but I don't think it would win.
Mm-hmm. I would also, I think, go under 6 wins, but I think it's going to be really, really close because I could see it actually add some wins from the last one. I would agree with you. Visual effects is happening. Sound is happening. I would say editing is happening. And if it gets a nomination in cinematography, it wins. If it gets a nomination in score, it wins. But those are big ifs because those categories gatekeep a shit ton. Would it surprise you to learn that the cinematography category, there has never been a sequel to a winning film that has also won? Probably wouldn't surprise you there because how many of those can there be? But not only that, only one time has there been 2 films from the same franchise nominated in cinematography. That is Batman Begins and The Dark Knight. Those 2 are the only time when 2 films in the same franchise have both gotten cinematography nominations, which, yes, means that The Godfather did not get a nomination for Part 1 or Part 2. It only got a cinematography nomination for Part 3. The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring, it won Best Cinematography. The Two Towers, Return of the King, were not nominated because this category absolutely gatekeeps the shit out of every single film. They are very cautious. They don't want to award something that's been done before. Hell, even Top Gun Maverick was a sequel. They gatekept it. They didn't let it in. They did not do it. Same with the score branch. The score branch, we've talked a lot about this on the channel. They don't nominate sequels. We even saw that this year. Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse did not get nominated. Of course, they do nominate sequels if they're from one particular composer named John Williams, but in the past 30 years, the only person that's been nominated for a sequel score is John Williams and Howard Shore. That's the asterisk. There is one time when a non-John Williams sequel score has been nominated, and it was The Lord of the Rings: The Return of the King.
Well, one thing a lot of people right now are trying to hope dig, but I don't know if it's actually going to happen, is an acting nomination for Dune Part 2. But I don't know. For acting, for me, that's the category that most depends on your competition. Because obviously, 100 movies that come out can compete in sound, cinematography, but not 100 films can compete in lead actor, supporting actress. It's really selective with those ones. So it really depends on what Timmy's competition is for lead actor. Because, like I said before, I think if this and Top Gun Maverick switch spots, Chalamet gets in over Paul Mescal for that 5th slot. This past year, Chalamet does not beat out whoever you want to call the number 5. If it's Domingo, if it's Wright, if it's Cooper. It's probably not Cooper. But between those three, he wouldn't beat out any of those. So I think it really just depends on who is in our lead acting race. We're in March. We don't know the real contenders yet. We can only theorize. Right now, I would have him out. I think he would possibly get CCA. Possibly get Globe. I know it's a new Globe's body, but this new Globe's body did do Tom Cruise. So maybe with 6 slots, he can find his way in there. I think if anyone is getting nominated for this film, it's going to be someone who has repetitively shown up at Oscar nominations for acting awards when he probably shouldn't be there, and that's Javier Bardem.
I would agree Javier Bardem's probably the most likely. Maybe Rebecca Ferguson as well, although supporting actress looks like a pretty strong category this year. But the most likely acting nomination for this film is SAG Ensemble. The ensemble is so strong, and in fact, if we want to see this as a potential Best Picture win contender, we have to see it in Best Ensemble at the SAG Awards. I think it's possible. I could even see this potentially making a run for a win, although Sing Sing makes that look very difficult because the narrative there is fantastic. Now, do you think that this is going to get snubbed in Best Director again, or is this Denis Villeneuve's time for nomination as he missed out on a couple of years ago?
I think currently he is in. However, if we have another populist film, whether that's Joker 2, whether that is Furiosa, if it's anything that can be considered populist, I think he goes
Megalopolis?
Out. I don't think Megalopolis would be considered populist, but I just think we are getting into a trend where you can say like, oh, we're getting one woman a year. We are sort of kind of getting one populist. That is quotations because populist is a very broad term. Obviously, COVID year does not have one of those, but the other years do. It could be Denis because of the residual love for him not getting in last time, feeling overdue, and most people, even people who don't love this film, are saying this is one of his better directorial efforts so far. It's his vision, and I feel like that could propel him. However, I do think the gatekeepness of a blockbuster, a sci-fi movie are going to hurt him if he is not in the winning conversation. I think it will come down to he's either 1 or 2, or he is 6 through 8. I don't think there's a world where he's 3 or 4.
That's what it comes down to for me, is that if he gets nominated, I think he's a strong contender for a win, because just like Christopher Nolan, something that they like going for in the Best Director category, for wins specifically, not as much for nominations, they like going for technical achievements, auteurs who are doing big spectacles with a voice. And that is what Dune is. So I could really see, even if this film is not in contention to win Best Picture, I could see what happens is Dune sweeps Best Director, and then Best Picture is decided by the screenplay categories.
Well, you say a voice. If he can get Timmy to use the voice on voters, I'm sure he could easily get that win for Best Director. But this film comes out right now, doesn't get delayed, or it comes out in November, doesn't get delayed. It's going against Oppenheimer. I don't think this is upsetting Oppenheimer. I know people are like, oh, Nolan should thank Denis and thank Warner Brothers for the delay. No, I think they delayed because of Oppenheimer. I know SAG played a part in that. Strikes were over by the time this film would have released. But I think they play in tandem. The money, it's better to come out now than it would just come out in November, as well as avoiding Oppenheimer, avoiding even Poor Things for that matter, and some of these technical categories where, looking like how things are next year, this, maybe Joker 2, which keep in mind are both Warner Brothers movies, are the only grand scale films competing against each other sure, throw Megalopolis in there as well for some of these technical categories, but like Furious is not going to be something that's also Warner. And I think we'll see, just like this year, Warner will put one above the other. Obviously, Color Purple was not as strong at the end of the day, but clearly the signs were there playing Monday Morning Quarterback that they never had faith in Color Purple. They didn't send it to any fests. They didn't give it anything. Obviously, Dune is not going to any fest. It came out in March. But we'll see with Joker coming up here soon. How do they play Joker? Is Joker just a box office thing? Are they sending it back to Venice? Are they going to try somewhere else this year with it? And I feel like if Joker's just coming straight to theaters, Dune's their push. If they send Joker to Venice, I could see them both being it. I can also see a world where Dune just gets in because of the movie and Warner's not really pushing it all that much.
That's fair. I don't think there's any world where Dune doesn't get in, but I think there is a world where they push both this and Joker 2. If this were released this past year, if this were in the Oscar season, I don't think much would have changed, but I do think it would have been more of a race. Not a race in the sense that, like, this would have been a contender to win, but I do think that the spectacle of this, the level of grandiosity in Dune Part 2, I think it would peel off some of the support that Oppenheimer had in some of those technical categories. I could see this taking away 3-4 wins from Oppenheimer, to be completely honest, from Poor Things. And not just that, it would also splinter support in some of those above the line categories as well, where, you know, maybe Christopher Nolan wouldn't be the consensus number one pick, and somehow someone like Yorgos Lanthimos could push forward because some of those votes for Christopher Nolan are being peeled off to Denis Villeneuve. Or in, like, cinematography, this would win. This would beat it if it gets nominated.
I think if this came out this year, Denis would not be nominated director. I think Nolan would still win there. I think obviously this wins visual effects if it comes out this past year. Seeing how the Oscar results played out, I think Zone would probably still win sound over this, because if they went with Zone over Oppenheimer, if Oppenheimer's competing against Dune, the votes are still going to go to Zone. It's not going to cave to Dune over there. So that's leaving possible upsets over Poor Things and costumes and makeup. So maybe you can find your way to 2 wins there, but I don't think it would win editing over Oppenheimer. I don't think it would win cinematography over Oppenheimer. I don't think it would make the director lineup, and it won't win a picture. So I would see this winning 1 or 2, maybe 3, but I still think with how Poor Things performed, Poor Things showed how strong it was overall. I think Poor Things probably still takes costumes, probably still takes makeup away from Dune Part 2. Obviously, we don't really know, without Dune being in the season, how narratives change, but with how the narrative currently is around Dune and how the narrative was at the end of that award season, Dune gets 6 nominations, 6, 7, 8 nominations. It's some peel away Napoleon stuff, take some stuff from Maestro, maybe take a Barbie nomination here or there, and then
Past Lives effects. Gone.
You know, I would agree Past Lives would be the movie to drop out a picture, but again, if Dune's out there and some other movies are losing stuff, I feel like Past Lives would not be in the 10, but something else would be 10. I don't think Zone would fall to 10. I don't think Anatomy would fall to 10, because I'm just going off of what was around 10 on nomination morning. I don't know what that new number 10 film would be, because it wouldn't be Dune.
Yeah, no, Dune would be much higher than that, I would assume. But that's what I mean. Past Lives would be the one to go, and I think the new one at the bottom would either be like American Fiction or Maestro. This is the end of this very, very long Dune discussion. If you're here, thanks for watching. Not all of our videos are this long. We just got really into Dune. We're just really into this subject matter. But we're going to be talking all of our fresh Oscar predictions for this coming year. Again, this is my favorite time of year. I love speculating about what is coming soon. I like talking about movies that I'm excited to see a lot more than movies that I've been talking about for 6 months. So I'm really excited for the season ahead. And if you are not subscribed right now, hit the button down below. Keep tuned. We are going to be talking about movies all the time, every single week, all year long.
Yeah, I mean, if you're out there, you haven't seen Dune yet, I don't know why you're still here. If you have seen Dune, I hope you got one of these bad boys, because it's the least you can do. Are you a true Dune fan if you don't have a Dune popcorn bucket? I'm a Regal goer, and I still went to AMC to get one, so what's your excuse? Let us know down below. But until next time, my name's Dyl.
And my name is Matt, and this has been Fantasy Filmball.